Hey, what's up with it, guys? Hey, welcome back to another video. Now, this is going to be another Moonkin Masterclass. Hopefully this one's a little bit simpler, but we're going to be going through crit versus hit, and I'm going to be explaining why I think they should be exactly equal when it comes to stat weights. The reason this is actually significant is most people, at least when you look on the stat weight sheets, don't actually have this valued the same, which in turn has made our BIS list and all of our best in slot items very contingent on having high hit, because hit is weighted significantly higher, about 30% higher on a lot of the different stat weight sheets. Now I'm going to explain to you guys my math and my logic of why I don't think hit should necessarily be valued higher. This is kind of like a new thought process in a sense, and if this is true, would completely change my priority on gear going forward because of this math and the way I'm kind of thinking through it. Hopefully this can make some sense to you guys, and I would love to know if you guys have any information that contradicts what I'm saying, because this is me theory crafting an idea and trying to explain it and let you guys know where I'm coming from. And if there's some kind of information or math or data mined information that I'm unaware of, I would love to know where that is and where to find it. So by all means, correct me down below if I am wrong. But with that being said, let's get into it. Okay guys, so here we have the Excel. Now I'm just going to go over these first two columns first, and then we'll kind of go into the more in-depth numbers here. But I wanted to set up a way to illustrate these numbers, and of course, you know, we had to pull out the quantum physics Moonkin Excel spreadsheet to illustrate the numbers the best way that we could. So with that being said, in this first column or series of columns, what I've illustrated is, let's pause real quick on that. There's a 1% chance to miss that you cannot avoid as a caster. No matter if you have 50% hit rating, you will still have a 1% chance to miss. You can't do anything about it as far as gearing and itemization. We're going to pretend like that doesn't exist for the sake of going over these numbers, because no matter what, that's not going to affect any of this one way or another either way, whatever you think. So to keep the numbers easier, we're going to ignore that exists, okay, just to keep the numbers simple. Now this first column here, what I'm doing is illustrating every 1,000 is basically a Starfire cast, and right now Starfire is hitting for pretty close to 1,000 depending on your gear and consumables, things like that. I have 100 casts. If we scroll down this Excel sheet, you can see this is consistent between all of these comparisons down to 102. It's 102 because we actually start at cell number 3 here, but you can see these totaled up. This is a formula. These totaled up to 100,000 damage. 100 casts, 1,000 damage per cast, boom, 100,000 damage. So this would assume we have a 100% chance to hit or a 0% chance to miss, and we have 0 crit chance. Now what we actually have in game, not really the 0 crit chance, but is we have a 16% innate chance to miss. So what I did to illustrate that is I turned all of these top 16 cells to zeros. You can see here, count is 16 cells to 0, which is down to 84,000 damage. That math checks out. Hopefully you guys can follow that. It's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, hopefully. Now let's go over these other columns that I did. Now I took my stat weights and I put these into this spreadsheet. So I have 11% chance to hit, which means I have a 5% chance to miss. So that 5% chance is illustrated by these top 5 cells being 0. I have a 12% chance to crit when I don't have a Nixia buff, and that's illustrated by these 2,000 numbers, right? Because if I'm critting, I'm dealing double damage. So I have 12 cells that are 2,000, and then the balance of all the cells are 1,000, giving us a total of 107,000 damage over 100 casts. Now, one thing to point out as far as the DPS value on all of these is I'm not calculating Nature's Grace into this at all. We'll talk about that at the end, but that's an additional DPS gain that I have not calculated into this for ease of numbers and to not make this too complicated. But the main argument, not really even argument, but the main counterpoint when we were talking about this in the Discord is that basically there's a chance that part of these crits could occur in these misses, meaning another way of saying that is that you can't actually crit unless you hit. So every time you miss, you're also missing potentially a 12% chance of that is going to be one of these crits. Now, the reason I don't think that that is the case, if that were the case, then hit would be valued way, way, way higher. The reason I don't think that that is the case is because if you remember back in like phase 1, phase 2, when people are rocking like greens and tier 1, people were raiding with 0% hit. Now, if you had a Nixia buff, if you had Songflower, whatever world buffs you could get, and if you could get up to 20 or 30% crit over the course of the raid, your miss chance would be really high if you looked on Warcraft logs, but your crit chance of all of your spells that landed for the most part would average out, and it would be very similar to what you had as far as your actual stats. What I mean by that is that if I had 16% chance to miss, right? If I'm rocking full tier 1 and greens and we're rating MC, and I get all my world buffs and I'm at a 30% crit chance, I might have a fight where I miss 15% of the time, but I would have 30% crit on average. If you averaged out the entirety of the raid, go over through the trashes, if you look at the logs, you would be able to see that the average of your hit and your crit was actually on par with what you were seeing on your character sheet. What that means is that these crits are calculated by 12% of the total, but that's factored into the balance of casts that actually are going to land. I hope that that's not confusing the way that I'm saying that. This is making sense in my head, and I'm hoping that I'm articulating it in a way that makes sense to you guys. But point being is that given the fact that the logs don't show a significantly reduced chance to crit based off of the actual items and buffs that you have, when you are running low hit setups, it makes me think that the hit is not, or the crit is not possible to fall within any of your misses. Otherwise, in this scenario, say we did have 30% crit here instead of this 0% that I have, 16% reduction on 30% crit is almost 5%. What that means is you'd be critting 25, you'd basically be losing a Songflower buff by not being hit capped. I don't think that that's the case because that's a really significant number, and that would be noticeable, especially because so many people are running with world buffs. It would be really noticeable to be able to see that deviation as far as what's different between someone's stats and their buffs and what's actually happening from a DPS perspective, especially if you look over the logs of the entirety of the raid. It's really easy to average out over all the casts on the whole raid, and you can kind of see these numbers in action. If it worked that way, where you're basically would be losing some of your crits in this number, you would see people's crit chance on logs be way lower, noticeably lower than their actual crit chance in game with whatever buffs and consumes that they have. So for that reason, I don't think that it works that way. Again, if there's information you guys have on that contradicts that, and there's some kind of data mined info or something like that, I would love to see it. But based on my experience looking at logs, that's really all I can use as far as my reference points. And so for that reason, I don't think that that's how it works. Now, to help simulate that these would be basically the exact same from a DPS perspective, is that we have this column here, which is my stats, right? 11% chance to hit, 12% chance to crit. Now, if I were to sub out, say, take off my Bloodvine chest piece and, the Bloodvine boots and put on some other pieces of gear, and I get down to 8% hit and 15% crit, I'm basically increasing the quantity of crits that are occurring on all the landed spells, and I'm also at the same time increasing the number of misses, right? I'm basically missing 3 more times over 100 casts, but I'm also critting 3 more times. So I'm losing 1,000 damage here, but I'm gaining another 1,000 damage on the 3 crits. You can see the total damage done between these two comparisons is exactly the same. Now, what this means to me is that hit and crit should be weighed exactly the same, just different versions of basically doing the same output. Obviously, if you're hit capped, you're going to be more consistent. You're going to be more reliable with your DPS. Things like Fairy Fire and Hibernate are obviously going to benefit from hit, whereas they're not going to benefit from crit, right? But from a DPS perspective, as we get into these, better pieces of gear coming out, if we're basically losing some hit, but simultaneously gaining the same amount of crit, it shouldn't be a DPS loss, which is currently, if you look at a lot of the spreadsheets, how they validate or weigh the gear, I should say. And guys, I just wanted to be really clear on my conclusion with this, is that if everything is occurring the way that I'm anticipating and expecting in these numbers, then hit should equal crit exactly. If it's not the case, and the reality is that some of your crits are happening within these misses, then what that means is that the top priority should be getting hit capped. Top priority should be getting hit capped, because if that's the case, then there's basically this hidden DPS loss of missing our crits that we have with all of our other buffs when we're world buff, things like that. So it should be one or the other. Either hit is going to be way heavier stat weighted, or they should be equal. And the reason that hit would be weighted way higher is if our crits are actually happening in these misses without a sing, which is not what I think the case is, but that's one of the two conclusions basically given these numbers. So let me know what you guys think. Hopefully I did a good enough job explaining this so that it's not super confusing and you guys at least see what I'm saying. And hopefully this kind of helps illustrate my point. You know, and if in this you're going to go down and basically trade off one more piece of, you're losing another piece of hit and adding one more piece of gear that has crit on it, this would go up to 2,000 and this would be 0, but your number would still be the same, right? And that's a setup with 7% hit and 16% crit. Now, all of these numbers assume that you're not getting crit or hit capped. Obviously, if you're getting hit or crit capped, that's a different scenario completely, and the stat weights are completely different than all of this. But assuming we're not at that point, assuming we're doing progression, you're wiping, what kind of gear should you be using, and what are the actual stat weights on that when you're just normal raid buffs and consumes? And this is what I'm coming to as a conclusion. So let me know if you guys have questions. Like always, comment, rate, subscribe. Let me know your thoughts on this. And if I missed anything, on that note, I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.